For any of you who've been following my work and are particularly interested in it for a while, you'll know that I've been writing a book for probably about 8 or 9 years about storytelling and exactly what it is. And I'd like to read maybe just a little extract of this book regarding what it means to actually study storytelling itself. I think that this particular extract from the book is so vital. I think that without it, without clarifying it, we've led to wrong understandings about what storytelling is. And has led to very simple, very, I would say, creatively destructive ideas about what it means to write stories, to tell stories, to imagine and reflect at all. So let me start here. This sets the whole foundation for the book. Our goal is to properly study storytelling and to understand it. This subject is particularly tricky for reasons that will become evident. So first, it requires a brief touch on the epistemology about how we can know anything at all. To truly study any subject, you need to recognize that your understanding is always filtered through a particular lens or framework. Certain things clearly belong to well-defined domains of reality. A rock belongs to the physical domain. A mathematical theorem belongs to the logical, abstract domain. A law belongs to the social and institutional domain. And once you recognize what domain something belongs to, you know how to study it. The framework matters because there are many ways to interpret the thing or process that we're wanting to understand. The wrong lens risks category errors, where you end up with the wrong understanding about the very thing you're trying to study. For example, someone who wants to study love and what it means. Someone studying love with a materialist viewpoint has you studying oxytocin and chemical reactions. And you end up calling love oxytocin, thinking you understood the kiss, without realizing you drifted into studying molecular interactions rather than a lived experience, which is probably what you wanted to understand in the first place. Or another example, after being shown all the colleges, libraries and classrooms, you still ask, but where is the university? Thinking that, without realizing that you were expecting a physical building rather than a social institution where education can take place in any of these buildings. The same drift happens historically, like when Buddha's analysis of lived experience became absorbed into Hindu cosmology, where karma and reincarnation were sort of emerged. Or when Plato's observations of lived experience morphed into Neoplatonism's theology of otherworldly realms and God, whereas it's argued that what he was asserting was not in that realm. So we need to decide which is the right ontological domain to avoid category mistakes about the thing we're studying, which is storytelling. Without that boundary, your inquiry dissolves in and has an ontological drift. You think you're studying love, for example. Suddenly you're knee-deep in studying dopamine and oxytocin. So in doing so, we commit ourselves to a set of philosophical ideas that accept particular ontological domains as fundamental and reject others. And this is where you get isms like materialism, phenomenalism, idealism, all these different worldviews and sets of ideas and philosophies that you can subscribe to. Okay, so we're seeking an understanding of how stories emerge. That's my topic. That's what I want to know. Not what storytelling is. I mean, that does come into play. I do want to understand that. But fundamentally, I want to know, how do stories emerge? Because I'm interested in the storyteller, in the person making the story, thinking of it, reflecting it, the person who has something to say and goes to such extents to create art, or write it in a bloody book with 1,000 pages. That's quite a thing to do. So I really want to understand why someone does that, and maybe bring the artist back to the art and the dreamer back to the dream, rather than giving rules and tropes and story structures about what makes a good story. It's deceptive, actually, because it turns out, firstly, that the definition of story is already blurry. But second, and most important, stories aren't even the subject of study, as I just sort of said, which I'll come back to. This part of the book is slightly less edited. It's fine. The tricky part with something like storytelling is, well, what domain does it belong to? Okay, so we have to kind of start with the premise of where stories emerge. They don't emerge out of soil. I can tell you they certainly don't emerge from AI. They're sort of echoes of the places that they really emerge, which is from a person's mind, from an inner world that an audience never gets to see, ever. Which, as a side note, I think that's quite an interesting observation about art in general. You can never know someone's inner world, and so we have this interesting workaround where we end up creating what we call art to kind of bring people into what they might see if they could see what we see up here. But anyway, let's carry on. In order to understand what you're doing when you really reflect on memories and fictional imaginings, you really have to dive into what's happening when you reflect on a memory and imagine even a fictional scenario. There are many ways to interpret what's happening when we reflect on memories and fiction. We need sets of ideas, an ideology, from which to understand what's happening. So, what would that framework be? What would that philosophy be? Because we need to find the most appropriate one. Many people assume that thoughts are just information processing. But when you honestly observe what happens when you reflect on a memory, or imagine a fictional scenario, or even contemplate an abstract truth, you realize that these contents don't merely exist as sort of external information that you process. Rather, you inhabit them. They appear to you with a sense of presence, as though you've travelled to them. A childhood memory doesn't feel like viewing a photograph or taking a document out of a filing cabinet. It feels like being there, even if faintly or partially. And it's the same with fictional stories. You close your eyes and you imagine it. You see it. You hear it. You hear what they say. You hear what happens. No matter how faint. You are witness to it. And then you tell a story about it. You write it down in a book. Or you go and depict it in films or theatre. So the place from which stories emerge happen up here, which you are witness to. And just like everyday life, in the real world, these experiences appear to you. That aligns with the description of phenomena, which means that which appears. And so phenomenology would probably be the most appropriate worldview to take. Okay, now this part's not very edited, but I'm going to try and get to the end. The question is the worldview developed enough? Is phenomenology as a worldview developed enough to use and to understand stories that emerge? I would say no, and that will become apparent. Not only that it's not fully developed, but the actual worldview was never claimed. We're just stuck with phenomena and phenomenology, which is the study of phenomena, or the study of that which appears. But the worldview, the ism, the set of ideas that is implicit in thinking that way, was never claimed, ever. And that would be phenomenalism. And that word, if you go and research what that word means, you'll find that it means something similar to idealism or even empiricism, which it's not right. It's outdated. Phenomenalism is the term that was being used when people were trying to develop a framework that eventually became the set of ideas that Martin Heidegger ended up developing and kind of solidifying that worldview and that area of study of phenomenology. The problem is he never claimed the word for the worldview, which is phenomenalism. And so all we have is the term phenomena and phenomenology, which is the study of phenomena, but the actual worldview, phenomenalism, was never claimed, and so the definitions are outdated. You get the definitions from the people who were studying it prior to that successful framing of the subject. And so for the next part of the book, I'm going to end up fleshing out phenomenalism as a worldview, which is implicit in the earlier works of like Heidegger, but as I said, was never claimed, and it needs to be, or else it's incomplete. And once I've finished fleshing that out, we can accept and adopt that worldview as the primary worldview from which we can actually study stories and storytelling. Then we can have a sort of framework that we can sort of like rest on, that describes a primary reality that is not, it does not acknowledge things like, I don't know, chemicals and neurons in the brain and atoms and an external world independent to ourselves. It acknowledges our own perception of reality as primary, and that's very, very interesting, because only in the worldview of phenomenalism you can say things like, or you can sort of claim terms like experiential monism, I think is what it's called, which says the substrate of any visual or audible or any experiential content is the same across reality with our eyes and ears and imagination. Basically means what you see when you close your eyes is the same as what you see when you open your eyes. Doesn't matter the fact that the place that you're seeing it is different. It puts dreams and imagination and the world around us on the same playing field. And that's very important, because now we can describe what it means to close your eyes and go to a place where stories are happening, which you can be witness to and tell people about in a book or on a film. And that's very, very interesting. And I think that we haven't got there. We haven't developed those ideas because the fundamental, I'd say that the foundational ideas were never, ever finished. And so the first part of the book is going to do that. And then the second part of the book will talk about storytelling specifically, what it means to tell stories. And the overall goal of the book is to bring dreamers back to their dreams, bring artists back to their art, bring witnesses back to their accounts. I want to give the vocabulary to people to justify why you don't need story structures, you don't need rules. You need to know what to look for that is significant enough to tell us a story. What does art mean? What does it mean to make art? What does it mean to be creative? And why do people like it? And this moves away from what is encouraged as a result of the past 100 years of narratology, which I think is completely wrong. It's the wrong approach. This you can tell that this was the main set of ideas, well, over the past 40 or 50 years, because you'll have heard of the hero's journey, probably. The hero's journey is that monomyth, or any sort of story structure. What is it? Dan Harmon's sort of story structure. It's a set of events that should happen for the best story to be. And it was encouraged, it was taught to use these story structures, and tropes are also part of that. Well, good stories have these tropes. It's like, okay, sure. You definitely saw that stories, films, tended to follow this hero's journey story structure, which got very boring very quickly. I think that writers are definitely becoming way more creative. And I also just want to touch on something very interesting. I found that this is a slightly different topic. When I was growing up, I always thought, let me just yeah. Okay, this links into the book as well, and I couldn't explain it before. When I was growing up, I always thought that writers, certain writers, not all of them, but certain ones, the ones that were responsible for really popular stories, knew something that I didn't. Like there was some secret. Especially the writers of the original Spider-Man trilogy, there was something about that which I couldn't place. Doctor Who, Lord of the Rings, even Harry Potter. Very, very, very popular. And something about them is very significant. It reveals to you something that is almost existential. And it's different to new writers or people who are new, who write good stories, but I don't know, they just lack something. They're interesting stories, but they just lack something. And I know you know what I mean by that. And for about 8 years, I didn't know what it was. What is it that they knew? And so I started researching. And then you come across things like the 3-act structure, and it's like, oh, okay, they must know how to structure stories properly. It's like, no, that's not it. And then I hear about the hero's journey. I'm like, oh, that's what it is. It's like, no, it's not. That's still not it. There's something else that they're doing, and I couldn't quite place it. And I tell you what it is. These stories, the writers that create these very, very popular stories, like Lord of the Rings, Spider-Man trilogy, Doctor Who in 2005, and even Stephen Moffat's Doctor Who in 2011, through the influence of Russell T Davies. I think he probably got some tips. I'll tell you what that is now. And Lord of the Rings. They were writing stories that were beyond just everyday life and curiosities like mysteries. They were writing stories that were reflective of existential situations and events. They were writing stories, and I'll tell you where they got these from. They were writing stories that were existentially significant. What that means is they were significant in a way that is recognizable to anyone, and it's so significant that anyone who witnesses those stories recognizes something very, very deep within them. These are stories about things like death and rebirth and scenarios that take place throughout human life that are so universal that when you tell stories about them in such a clear way, it validates something to you on an existential level that no one else is able to do. It reflects back to you your experience of actually being human and existing. So what is it? What was their secret? Doctor Who used tarot cards, which I'll explain what they are. They're not fortune-telling cards. That's not primarily what they are. They also used biblical stories and myths. Now, there's something about tarot cards, biblical stories, and myths that is different to just everyday stories, and this is also why the hero's journey was, to some degree, quite powerful, if understood correctly. And that's because that's the monomyth. It's like the generalized story across all myths. It reflects something existentially truthful about existence itself. That's what tarot cards are. They're scenarios that reflect very, very clearly, but in an abstract way, types of scenarios that are very existential, like the Tower card, for example. Those situations where things just collapse, and the imagery is, I think, psychologically significant. I think there's certain imagery that we have that is buried deep inside our unconscious that tarot cards also reflect. And so when you see the imagery, there's something about it that is, it touches you on a deeper level than just those sort of superficial stories about mysteries and I don't know, conflict and stuff. Like, for example, you can tell that there's certain imagery that is psychologically embedded within us, that the unconscious parts of our brain respond to before we even consciously process. For example, one of my best friends told me about how babies respond to the image of faces when they're in the uterus. They respond to those images. That's wild. It means that there's something inside them that recognizes that before they've even ever experienced it. And it's the same with things like snakes. I think it's your amygdala. If any of you understand this properly, you can enlighten me to it. But I think it's the amygdala that unconsciously responds to images of snakes or shapes that look like snakes on the floor before we've ever even seen it. And I think that also, those sort of deep psychological images are also, they also span across things like the dark. There's something about the dark that touches our unconscious mind. Spiders, the image of snakes. I think a lot of this sort of imagery embedded in myths and tarot cards is very, very, it touches us on a very deep level. And that's what these writers did. They used tarot cards, biblical stories, and myths to tell stories about those sorts of scenarios that you probably wouldn't think to tell in such a clear way. Certainly you wouldn't think to use that sort of deep psychological imagery. And it's very interesting. It's throughout Doctor Who and Lord of the Rings. I'd never seen Lord of the Rings before. I watched it in the cinema last year, and I think it was the second film where I saw that obviously there was a tower. There was the Tower of Sauron. And before I watched the third film, I said to my mum, I know that Lord of the Rings is based on tarot cards a lot, and other types of existential stories. And I just said, I don't know what's going to happen, but I've got a slight feeling that that tower's going to come crumbling down, just like the tarot card. Anyway, if you're particularly interested in my academic work, then stick around. I think it's going to be very interesting. And I think it's going to be very useful for people, storytellers, who really want to understand storytelling on a very deep level beyond just prompts and tropes.